Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Chan, and I am the Assistant Dean for the Program for Faculty Development here at the Faculty of Health Sciences. I'm really excited to have all of these guests here today, and I'm really excited to have our panelists here to facilitate this session. You're tuning in to Online Learning 201. We had a 101 that we've put up as an enduring kind of YouTube event archive, so definitely check that out. If you're tuning into this on YouTube, you can check out the other event, but definitely would love to be able to welcome you to this event. So last time we kind of introduced people to the idea of this toolbox of things that you need for teaching online. And so we'll be talking about that more today. And what we'll be doing is diving a little bit more into teaching on Zoom and some of the intricacies here.
So in terms of who's here, we kind of all discussed this already. It's a mixture of clinicians, educators, and researchers. But as we begin the conversation, if you'd like, it would be nice for you to introduce yourself in the chat, just your name and where you're from, and that will help us orient ourselves as we continue the dialogue and get into the case discussions. So feel free to do that as I'm speaking. So starting off, what is online teaching? What are some general principles? So online education is, as it sounds, it's the delivery of education through online mediums. So typically this is typically through Zoom. It can be Microsoft Teams. It can be Avenue to Learn. There's different ways in which online education is currently done, but I wanted to flag some of the differences between online education and in-person teaching to start. So online teaching, as you've probably figured out, is either asynchronous or synchronous, which means that you either need to be there in the moment with the learners, or you can pre-record, pre-curate content and resources and provide them to your learners as required. In online education, you can do either large or small group sessions, and typically you have multiple options for different software, different tools, different channels that you can use. And because of that increased flexibility, sometimes it's very confusing to decide what is the right thing to use for an intended purpose. Now, contrast that with in-person sessions, where we have largely lecture style or small group discussions, and beyond that, there's a little bit less variety sometimes, it seems, because we don't necessarily rely on technology as much. We simply vary the types of interactions that we have and go from there. But I wanted to emphasize that regardless of the environment that we're trying to engage learners in, it needs to be an environment where learners are kept accountable for being active and being alert and responsible for their uptake of the knowledge or the skills that we're trying to impart on them, or they're trying to learn with their peers. So the challenges with online learning sometimes, and this influences us as educators quite a lot, is a lack of motivation to continuously engage in content over time, a lack of engagement. Perhaps we feel isolated, or perhaps we feel like we can't really relate to the peers that we're taking the course or the workshop with. The feeling of isolation, especially in this pandemic. It's hard to go out and socialize, and so there's an increased need to have that encompassed within the type of education that we do. Sometimes it requires more preparation, actually, because you need to be able to answer more questions. You need to be able to do more work outside of your typical expectations for what you would be doing in an in-person setting. Then when it comes to time, sometimes it's surprising, but as educators, it's very important for online education to also have more strict boundaries of when you're on and when you're off. Now, with the fact that people can message you all the time, they can interact with you all the time, sometimes it's a little scary because you'll get emails at 10 p.m., 3 a.m., it'll be at all hours of the day, but it's just important for individuals to understand, your learners to understand what your operating hours are and when they can expect to receive a response. And typically I found that if you manage those expectations, it doesn't really matter when they message, because there will not be any anxiety about you not having read something, because they will know when to expect a response from you. So the big question is when you have in-person teaching and you're suddenly asked to transfer things online, Is it simply a transfer process? Do I simply shift everything that I'm doing in person to an online format? And the answer isn't yes, and the answer isn't no. Unfortunately, it's one of those things where you have to say maybe. It actually depends. So learning environments, again, they need to be designed to meet the needs of the learner. So sometimes that means you're going to have to take extra effort to put more content together. Sometimes it needs to be more effort to creating additional tools or channels for communication to have between yourself as the educator and the student. But overall, there can be a similar flavor. Just depends on what you did in the in-person interactions. But examples of questions that a learner may have, and this may influence your case studies later on when you have your discussions, questions may be, what is expected of me? Sometimes they're not understanding what the assignments entail. They don't understand what they need to learn. How do I check that I am really learning and understanding concepts? Learners often come with the best of intentions, but they don't know if they're doing well. So if they read a piece of information, an article, if they complete a module, if they are asked to read a chapter, which components should they be pulling out? And how do they really know that they understand what is relevant for future success? How is this relevant? How does this tie to overall course objectives? When and where can I ask questions? Do you have office hours, or do you ask questions ad hoc as needed through email? Are there additional resources to learn? Sometimes there are great series on YouTube. There's a TED Talk. There's websites where they can find more information. Perhaps an additional textbook. It's always helpful as an educator to just point them to additional resources as required for their learning. Who are these people learning with me? So this is not a question that you would get a lot before the pandemic, but now increasingly as we move into online interactions, we're in spaces where we've literally never met these people before. So we're going to find ourselves as educators also need to do things like icebreakers and need to introduce people to each other and have them create that safe environment where learning can happen. And there's a lot of questions around that and a lot of thinking that needs to be done. But it is very important to understand that learning environments are things that need to be created, nurtured, and it's not just going to happen because everyone's around in that same course. Do I belong here? So I work with some medical students as part of the MF tutorials, and a lot of the time there's a sort of crisis they're having. They don't know if they know enough relative to their peers. So there's going to be a lot of making sure that people feel as though they are intended to be in the program, they are intended to be in this class, and just validating that what they know, what they've achieved academically so far is enough to get them to where they are today. So again, the social aspect. And last but not least, how is this evaluated? It's not very difficult with tests, with exams, but sometimes it's quite challenging for written assignments, reports, innovation projects on my end especially, where there are no rubrics, there are no rules or written expectations, and so that leads to a lot of confusion. And when it's an in-person environment, you can manage that confusion by being available to answer questions, by being able to have them talk to their peers. But when you're in an online setting, it actually leads to disengagement. So just make sure that, especially within an online forum, that effective communication and clarity around expectations is almost even more important because it can't be buffered by opportunities to interact with you directly, read your nonverbal expressions, and also interacting with their peers. So in terms of how to actually manage all that information, we've been thinking about putting together a bit of an online teaching checklist. And we talked about this last time during Online Teaching 101, and we talked a bit about setting clear expectations, ensuring that the relevance of the course asks are really clear for what the learning path looks like, having things like direct communication channels with peers, having feedback, opportunities for social interactions, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, from going through a checklist, which I think is helpful for some people, we found that all of these expectations on the checklist actually fit into 4 buckets. And that's where we came up with the Online Teaching Toolkit, which I think is a really, really neat way of thinking about what needs to be true for an online learning experience. And then from there, you can design a productive environment in which your learners will be able to learn what they need to. So the first component of the online teaching toolkit is the face-to-face place. So we have Zoom right here. I can't unfortunately see most of your faces, but Zoom, like Google Hangouts, like WebEx, is the place where you can begin to build social rapport. You can see someone's face, you can hear what they say, listen to how they say it, but also see their facial expressions. And so that's how the beginning of the social interactions, and the beginning of creating a sense of place where people feel like they belong, and they begin to create relationships with one another, including yourself as the educator. Then second thing that you need to have as an online teaching environment is a digital corridor. So as you can imagine, maybe based on your own experiences, you don't come up with all your questions in the learning session, in the asynchronous learning session. You don't talk to all your peers in that learning session. And so what we're finding that learners are creating themselves is channels for them to communicate between lectures, between sessions, to work on assignments, to get a better sense of what the expectations are, etc. And so things like Slack, things like Facebook Messenger, Microsoft Teams are excellent kind of back channels where individuals like you or students can actually engage with one another and get the clarifications that they need, or those additional conversations that they need to be successful. The third component of the online teaching toolkit is productivity tools. And this is more or less relevant depending on the work that you're doing. I typically find that productivity tools really depend on whether the learners see the need for it. So things like project management tools, Asana is an example, they are very helpful when you have several people working on a project and they need to delegate tasks to one another. So perhaps that's not needed for every single course, but for a research group, it may be very helpful to set deadlines to make sure that things are moving along as they should be. Whereas things like Google apps like Google Docs or Google Slides are really helpful collaboration tools, even for medical students in the PBL tutorials, to be able to share information, to be able to set objectives together and make sure that they're sharing images or links to relevant articles as they need to do so. Then finally, social touch points. So I know that I already talked about these social interactions, these conversations happening in the digital corridor, but it's important to note that these kind of social touch points can also happen synchronously through how you design interactions on the face-to-face place. So over Zoom, it's essential for us to be able to engage in small groups or in the larger classroom in a check-in exercise. So see how people are doing. Do they want to share something that they did that was exciting over the weekend? Even things like that, just to bring a bit of a human element, are very, very helpful to increase group cohesion and also make sure that everyone feels welcome and included and like they know others who are in that learning experience with them.